In October of 2012, a guy named Felix Baumgartner set a world record for skydiving. He jumped from a height of 24 miles above the Earth's surface. If you see pictures of him, he's dressed more like an astronaut than a skydiver because of the protective equipment that he had to wear for this. He achieved speeds of above 800 miles per hour. And in doing that, he became the first human being to break the sound barrier without using a vehicle. Now, this is not just as easy as falling out of an open door and then pulling the parachute at the right time. If he didn't maintain complete discipline and keep his body in just the right position the whole way down, then he'd go into an uncontrolled spiral and would literally be ripped apart. Now, he did maintain his position and was able to land safely, but can you imagine that? I mean, standing on the edge of this launch vehicle and just looking down 24 miles, knowing that there's nothing below you between you and the earth, and then taking that step. That's crazy. I mean, it's also inspiring, it's also amazing, but there's no doubt that's a little bit crazy. His example here is one that is really a true step of faith. Today we're going to look at another step of faith that we see in the scriptures. It's important for us to remember that there is no step of faith that comes without risk. There's no step of faith that's safe fully, because faith, by definition, means that we're not sure, 100% sure of what's going to happen next. There are no guarantees. That's why it's called faith, not evidence. So what we're going to look at here, the passage today, is in Matthew chapter 14. And we're going to start, the section starts in verse 22, and we see that Jesus and the disciples are there, and Jesus has just fed 5,000 people. And then he sends the disciples across the lake, and he says he's going to stay and pray on the mountain for a while. And so he prays through most of the night, and the disciples are trying to get across the lake, but they're beat up by these winds that are not cooperating, and the waves are keeping them from reaching shore. Then verse 25 says, "Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, the disciples, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid.' 'Lord, if it's you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come out to you on the water.' 'Come,' Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why did you doubt?' The disciples had been struggling all night to get across this. They weren't making progress because of the way the winds were and the waves. These guys knew what they were doing on the lake. They were professional fishermen, and yet they had not made the progress that they wanted to. They hadn't arrived at their destination. They were exhausted. They were cold. It was pitch dark. It was probably 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And this is the environment that Peter takes his step of faith in. He steps out of the boat and tries to walk on the water. Now, we're not talking about a calm swimming pool here that's perfectly flat. This is deep, churning water that's being driven by a gale in the dark. And Peter steps out of that boat because Jesus tells him to. That's taking a risk. This is the type of thing that a step of faith can look like. I mean, you might never jump out of a space capsule or just step out of a boat to try to walk on water. But even if you don't see yourself as a risk taker, you take risks every day. When we get in our car to go anywhere, we never know exactly what's going to happen. Even when we just walk in our house, we don't know that we're going to arrive safely. None of us know the future or what's going to happen. And we still take those risks. because they're normal, everyday risks for us. But if you're a follower of Jesus, then you're also called to live a life by faith. Now, when you take that first step of saying yes to Jesus at the beginning of your response to him, maybe you said, Jesus, even though I can't see you, I'm going to trust that you are alive, that you are raised from the dead, that you were resurrected. I'm going to trust that you are who you say you are, that you are the Son of God. And I'm going to base my life on what you say. Those are significant risks that we take at the very beginning of our walk with Christ. And it doesn't end there. We continue to step out in faith. Here at Cabot United Methodist Church, we're a part of this body of believers because of the steps of faith that people have taken over the last hundreds of years. Our church is almost 200 years old. Now, those first believers who gathered in Knox Chapel in those days, they gathered there, they didn't know the long-term effects of what they were doing. We see the church as having always been in the community because it's been around longer than any of us have been alive, but they didn't have that sense of certainty or assurance. They just took a step of faith to gather together, to worship Jesus, and to help the community know him. And now we're able to see fruit from that 200 years later because they took the step of faith. And of course, there have been many other significant steps of faith over the years. Even purchasing the school that we worship in now, and the Winfield School, it would have been much easier to stay in the old church building. I mean, it had its limitations. It's not much parking there, and you guys had kind of outgrown the space at that point. But boy, there were some significant encounters with God that many of you had had within the walls of that church building. And yet you took a step of faith and purchased a school and worshiped there. And then even just recently building the sanctuary. And all of the work that so many of you put into that, the commitment, the financial giving, the sacrifice of your time and your service. And why? Because Jesus called this congregation to that. And you stepped out. You took the risk. You stepped out in faith for the sake of the community hearing the good news of Jesus. And many of you continue to take steps of faith today. I have really loved talking with so many of you and getting to hear some of the ways that God has been working in your lives and ways that you've been serving. And I heard some of you say that when you stepped into the role that you're in now, you didn't know how it was going to work. You didn't know if you were going to be able to do it. You didn't know if it was going to work with your schedule and the time. And yet, because you took those steps of faith, you have impacted others. And I've seen that already in the short time that I've been here. And we know that we might not see a tangible reward for some of those steps of faith that we take. But yet we take them if Jesus calls them to. We are called to Jesus-centered steps of faith, which does mean risk. Now, a little bit of clarification here as we're talking about faith and risk. Some people have misinterpreted Jesus' challenge here. We're dealing a lot with issues of risk and faith in times of this pandemic. I saw a picture of a woman holding a sign that said, "Jesus is my vaccine." She was protesting. No, he's not. Jesus never promises to be a vaccine for us. That's not the way he works. That is not a scriptural view of who Jesus is or what he does for us. He doesn't promise us that we won't get sick or that we won't die. In fact, Jesus, using the word, he quotes words from Deuteronomy. He says that we are not to put the Lord our God to the test. We are to take precautions. We're not to be reckless and say, hey, God is going to protect me no matter what. In fact, this was how Jesus was tested in the desert by Satan. Satan took him up to a high place and said, throw yourself off of here and God's going to protect you. Satan even quoted scripture. He quoted Psalm 91, which is a great psalm of protection. And he said, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. We can't quote this psalm and name it and claim it that God will protect us from any harm and from the pandemic. No, that's what Satan tried to do, and Jesus corrected him. So we live with faith and we take risks, but that doesn't mean that we don't wear a seatbelt when we go driving. No, it doesn't mean that we throw ourselves off a cliff. And when the recommendations from the CDC and the guidelines are that we wear masks, we do that. And if we're called to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. When we wear masks where it's called for, that doesn't so much protect us. It does provide some protection for the one who wears the mask, but especially it provides protection for others who aren't wearing the mask, or for others around us, because there's a chance at any moment that we might have the coronavirus and not be aware of it yet, because it doesn't show up with symptoms until days after we're already contagious. And so by wearing a mask where it's appropriate, then we're protecting the people around us. And this is part of the being gentle as doves. We protect those around us. And if you can, physically, if you're able to, please get the vaccine. And not just for yourself, but for the sake of the people around you that we'd have the chance to pass it around to. Our numbers in the county have gone to the substantial level of transmission over this past week. And so the CDC does recommend that we wear masks when we're in public, in group gatherings. And that includes even for those of us who have been vaccinated. So I encourage you to listen to that. We as a church will be continuing to monitor the situation as well. What we're talking about here with risks and steps of faith, these are Jesus-centered risks that he calls us to. And we step out when he calls us to do that. Every step of faith requires courage. When the disciples saw Jesus coming across the water, they thought it was a ghost because they'd never seen anyone walk on water before, and they were scared. But Peter responds then beyond that, because Jesus says immediately to them, "Take courage, it's I, do not be afraid." Peter then takes courage. The others didn't. That's why we talk about this story as Peter walking on the water, not the disciples staying in the boat. Peter took that courage. Faith is not all about the feeling that we get when we're listening to beautiful worship music, or we're participating in worship together, or about sitting in our chairs and reading our Bibles by ourselves. That can be a part of experiencing faith, but faith always has an element of risk. It's about guts, what it takes to face even our fears. Felix Baumgartner holds that skydiving world record because he was willing to face his fears. He was afraid, interestingly enough, not of heights, but he was afraid of confined spaces. As he was in training, the capsule that he had to go up in was a tiny capsule to get up there. And he actually almost quit his training because of his extreme claustrophobia. And so he went through a time of counseling and working through that until he was able to work and to take that risk of going up there in that confined capsule. He had the courage to stand above the earth take that step out into emptiness, because he was willing to face that risk. Every step of faith requires courage. So to take a step of faith, we need to listen for God's prompt. The first thing Peter did was make sure that it was Jesus. He saw this, what might have been a ghost coming across the waters, and he said, "Okay, Jesus, if this is you," I'm not sure that it is because I've never seen anything like this before, "but if this is you, tell me to come out on the water with you." And Jesus said, "Come." So he wanted to make sure that this wasn't just his own desire or something cool that he wanted to do. He knew that he could not do that on his own power. But if Jesus was asking, then Jesus was going to be responsible for the outcome. Walking on the water is a cool idea if it works, but Peter knew it had to be God's idea for it to work. Because faith is not this magical force that enables us to get what we want if we just believe. Faith is a response to God's prompt. A few years ago, I felt God leading the church I was serving at the time to do a block party. We wanted to reach into the community, and so we had a festival with games and with free food and bounce house and bands and everything, all free to the community. We wanted to connect with people, and boy, we stepped out and we started planning for it. But then those couple of days before we did it, I got nervous. Like, what if this doesn't work? What if nobody shows up? What if this is just a total and complete failure? But then in prayer the day before, I felt God was saying that if we cast the nets, then he was going to bring the fish. All we had to do was be obedient. And we are listening to his prompting that he told us to cast the net of the block party and that he would bring people to engage in it. And it went great. I mean, lots of people came. We had a great connection with the community. We did it several more years. We even, from that first one, we had people who ended up joining the church. We had youth who came to be a part of the youth ministry and who did not have an experience with Jesus before then. And so we could see some visible fruit from that because we were willing to take that step of faith. I wish I could say that, well, since then I've always had a trusting attitude, but no, I still wrestle with my fears and my doubts too. But the principle is real. When we hear from God, we will be able to take a step of faith. Of course, one of the questions we have is, how can we know for sure that we're hearing from God? Well, you can't know 100%. Unless something is written in the Bible, is clear in the Bible, in context, then we can't know for sure. Now, you shouldn't be wrestling with yourself saying, oh, God, is it your will for me to stay faithful to my spouse? Yes, it is his will. That is very clear. It's something that's clearly spelled out in the scriptures. God, should I tell the truth in this business deal? Yes, you should. Again, clear in the scriptures. But there are lots of decisions that we face in our lives that we don't have that clear yes or no in the Bible. Which job should you take? What way should you serve or step into a new way of serving? We don't know. We have to, but the lesson is to listen to God's prompt and then be willing to step out. Don't wait for a guarantee because God does not give those very often. So be willing to step out. Sometimes when we do step out, we'll be in the deep waters. We'll be over our heads if we were to sink. We'll be in the deep end of the pool or the ocean there. So when we're in over our heads, we have to learn to float. There are times that God calls us to take a step in those places. When Peter heard come, he knew that it was only Jesus who would keep him above the water. When we step out, we have to learn to float with Jesus. Heidi Baker is a missionary in Mozambique and a worldwide speaker, a great follower of Jesus. She's told this story about the walk with God being kind of like when we're in the water. Sometimes we just go to the beach and we just stroll along the beach. Our feet are getting wet and we're experiencing that, but we're in total control. And we know how much we're doing. Even when we wade out a little ways, up to your knees, we're still in control because our feet are on the ground and we can go where we want to go. But when we're out in the deep waters, beyond where our feet can touch, then we start to get anxious. We can't move exactly the way we want to. We don't know exactly what the water is going to do. And either it will upset us or we learn to float. A step of faith might take you into the deep water where you can't be in control. Learn to float. Jesus will hold you. So to take a step of faith, we need to learn to float if we're going to be, because we will be over our heads sometimes. And we have to be willing to fail also. Immediately, so Peter, when he steps out, he starts walking on the water and he sees Jesus, he's walking towards him, but then he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he starts to see the wind and he's looking at the waves and he starts to sink and he cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reaches out his hand and catches him. And then he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now, I've heard a lot of sermons preached on this passage, and some of them take the angle of Peter as a failure because he doubted. And certainly he should have kept his eyes on Jesus, and he would have continued to walk all the way out towards him. But he also walked on water. That's more success than the rest of the disciples had who stayed in the boat. And then when he started to sink, Jesus caught him so he didn't drown. But we hate failing, don't we? I mean, me certainly. I was at camp a couple of years ago and was going to go rock climbing. And I was training for my belaying certification beforehand so that I could help others. I could spot others while they were climbing too. And took the test for it the first time, and I failed. Immediately, my mind started making justifications. And I was like, oh, well, you didn't say the answer to that one, or, well, that one that I missed. I mean, I thought that you were asking about. No, I just failed. Yeah. But then I went back and studied more and retook the test, and I was much stronger and better than I was before I had failed. Even if I had just passed it the first time, I wouldn't have been as strong at it as I was afterwards. I learned something from it. And usually with failure, we do. When we watch kids, it's interesting. They don't seem to have as much of the fear of failure often as we do as adults. They're used to learning in some ways. Everything is new. And so there's more of a sense of being willing to take a risk with learning something new and not looking like you have it all together. But as adults, we like to be successful, right? But faith takes a step of risk, even in spite of the fear of failure. If God has spoken it, then we're going to respond and go for it. Don't decline a ministry opportunity that God sends to you just because you aren't sure that you can do it perfectly. Don't be afraid to fail, because Jesus will catch you. So to take a step of faith, we also need to just step out. Sometimes we do so much waiting for God's words, trying to make sure that we're 100% certain that we know for sure that this is what we're supposed to do, that we don't actually do it. John Ortberg wrote a book with this title. He said, if you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. We need to step out. Here at Cabot right now, we're experiencing a time where we're working to reboot a lot of our ministries and to move forward into the future and to continue to grow our outreach in the community and our discipleship within the church. And we have a lot of opportunities right now for new people to step into new ministry roles. Some of those we're looking for some staff people, even for a youth director, somebody who has a passion for helping teenagers know Jesus and walk following him. We're looking for a musician, an accompanist or a music director who can help lead our worship of Jesus together. And then we're looking for a lot of non-staff positions as well. For one, we're looking for some people to lead groups, whether it's a Bible study or a small group discussion group or a book study. We want to be able to grow together in our discipleship, and we need small groups to be able to do that. So we need people who are willing to take a step of faith and lead a group of people. You don't have to know everything. You just have to be willing to facilitate a conversation, help organize people, and provide a little bit of structure to the time. Yeah, maybe that's a Sunday morning in Sunday school, or maybe it's a different time of the week. But we're looking for people who can serve in these ways. It's risky. It's risky to step into something like that when you don't know exactly what is going to happen in the future. But if God is calling you to it, then take that step of faith. Sometimes all you need is 20 seconds of courage to do that. That's probably all the time that it took Peter to actually get out of the boat. When Jesus told him to come out on the water, Peter climbed out of the boat and he got onto the water. Maybe 20 seconds of insane courage. Maybe it's just enough time that you need to open your mouth to a friend and say, can I tell you about the time that Jesus helped me through a similar situation? Then the conversation goes from there because you had the courage to open your mouth for the first time. Or maybe it's the courage to, in your heart, just say yes to the Holy Spirit's prompting of leading you. Does fear go away after the first few steps? No, not usually. But you feel the fear and you can do it anyway. What is it that you're shrinking from? Maybe you know what God is asking you to do and you've been hesitant. You've been waiting for a clear sign from him, or you've been waiting to feel like you knew enough to be able to do it. Or maybe it's something that's so far long ago that you've almost forgotten it, but not quite. I've missed some faith steps in my life, but I know the best parts of my life have come when I have responded with the yes of risky obedience. Take your step of faith and see what God has prepared for you. Let me pray for you now. Lord, thank you for the ways that you are leading us. Please help us to take the steps out of the boat. Help us to see the risk and to step into it because you're calling us to it. Lord, give us courage and help us to float in your power, not to have to do it all ourselves, but to yield to you and to what you're doing. Lord, give us that 20 seconds of courage and to be able to say yes to you or to be able to voice this to someone else. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.